to my immediate right, we have Susanne Bouma, who's Head of Partnerships and Programs Renewable Aviation at Neste.
Very correct.
Correct. And next to her is Rachael Everard, who's Head of Sustainability EMEA at Rolls-Royce. Then we have Nikhil Sachdeva, Global Head for Sustainable Aviation at Roland Berger. And at the end here, we have Toby Edwards, who's the co-CEO of Fly Victor. So your panel, thank you. Now, to begin with, and I'm sure people have strong views on this in the audience as well, I think it's important that we recognise that the aviation industry in general has work to do when it comes to becoming more sustainable and tackling emissions. I think we can all agree on that. That's why we're here. But having said that, we just need to put it into a little bit of context as well. So if you were here yesterday, you might have caught a session. One of our speakers, Travis Wright from QTS Data Centres, and he shared the fact that data centres actually have more impact on the environment than the aviation industry based on pre-COVID flight numbers. So I think what's important here is that aviation is just a more visible target in a way. So it is visible, but it's far from the biggest offender when it comes to emissions. And so I think it's important to say that. So we know that work needs to be done, but we are trying to tackle that. So today we're going to talk about the challenges that aviation faces and the solutions that are not just flights of fancy, if you like, but they're actual real-world solutions that are available right now, today, to make aviation more sustainable. And the fact is as well, aviation is not going anywhere, right? It's the numbers are only going to be rising as we continue to bounce back from the pandemic as well. So it's really important that we do all that we can to make all flights as clean and green as possible. I'm sure, Toby, actually, I'm sure you agree, and maybe you can explain the measures that you are taking at Fly Victor to be more sustainable in your operations.
Sure, thank you very much for having me. Nice to be here to see you all face to face. I think you start just high level. Climate change is happening. Paris Agreement came into force in November 2016. We're a 10-year-old business, so that's quite a significant part of our journey. We are absolutely committed to net zero by 2050, and as one of the leading on-demand private jet charter businesses, of course we have to take responsibility to lower our emissions. So if we go specifically at Victor, our mission is a better way to fly, and sustainability is integral to everything we do. And if I give just an example of that, I'm on the panel with my colleague Susanne from Neste, and we've launched a partnership back in June, which enables every single one of our customers to purchase sustainable aviation fuel instead of fossil fuel on any booking anywhere in the world, irrespective of the airline or the route. So that's a pretty good example. I also think just as businesses, it makes business sense to make sustainable actions. Obviously, we're in aviation, but I think all businesses, enough's been said by top management consultancies, for example, Boston Consulting Group. You will have an enhanced brand if you become obsessive with sustainability. You will have far greater customer loyalty if you're obsessive about sustainability. And ultimately, the value of your business is more likely to be higher if you're working in sustainability. So hopefully that gives you kind of a bit of insights. Thank you.
Absolutely. Rachael, turning to you now as well, as one of the biggest aviation engine manufacturers at Rolls-Royce, you're probably best placed on the panel here to explain the biggest challenges for moving aircraft to more sustainable power sources. So what are those? What are those challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a number of challenges, and the most basic is that we have to take a big piece of metal, we fill it with people and precious lives, and then we take it up in the air. So you're kind of playing around with the boundaries of physics, and then you're trying to find a way to make that sustainable. And flying takes a huge amount of energy. The energy density that's required in order to take off and land safely, propel people at, hundreds of miles, thousands of miles per hour, we shouldn't underestimate that. And then to try and find a way, as I say, to make that lower carbon. But as an industry, as everyone on the panel here today, we're absolutely committed to making that happen. But we have to kind of work within that regulatory environment that is so critical to product safety. There's no kind of shortcuts to be taken here. Any new technology that we want to bring to the market, that we want to demonstrate, has to be proven for all of the right reasons. But it can make it challenging. It can make it quite slow to bring about change. And I think some of the solutions that we'll unpick a little bit this morning are things that we can do quite short term to try and make some of those changes. But there's this balance to be struck between making sure that that is safe and certified. And I think the other challenge is that we are an industry of multiple different players, different parts of the system. I don't know another industry that's quite so interconnected, incestuous, if you want to use the word. And you need the whole system to come together to transform. And particularly in aviation, you're not taking off and landing at the same place. That's, inherently with our nature, it's an international business, and that policy environment has to move with us as well across the world.
And just picking up on the point there, you talked about certification, for instance, and having covered the aviation industry in a previous role, I know that the hoops that have to be jumped through when it comes to certification. So just put that in some kind of context. Like, let's say, for instance, you came up with a new engine at Rolls-Royce that ran on a completely different fuel system or whatever. How many years does that take to actually get certified? If all things go absolutely perfectly.
Very difficult to put a number on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking 5 years plus, probably, from kind of concept through to production. The certification hoops, they're there for the right reasons, don't get me wrong, but they're not easy to get through. And I think one of the things we're seeing is that we need to play these different technologies, and we need to work on them simultaneously, because some things will get through faster, others are going to take longer.
Okay. Nikhil, why is it that the aerospace sector is still so reliant on these kind of fuels when other forms of transport have been able to make the transition to more sustainable power sources?
Yeah, I think Rachael already alluded to it. It's the power densities. So kerosene, which is the fuel that we use, it's Jet A that a lot of people will have heard of. It's immensely power dense, but it's power dense in two different ways, right? So there's gravimetric density, which is how heavy is it, and there's volumetric density, which is how much volume does it take up, right? And it's power dense in both those ways. So if you look at other solutions around the world, right, the big ones that are being discussed for aviation are batteries, which are actually extremely not dense, right? Very, very low density in both those different formats. And hydrogen, which is being talked about a lot, right? It's actually, from a weight perspective, it's wonderful. It's actually way better than kerosene. But from a volume perspective, it's horrendous. And you need solutions to either make the plane a lot bigger to fly the same number of people and the same number and the same amount of distance.
Yeah.
Or you need to shorten your distances or reduce the number of people, and it becomes a very complex equation at that point to make sure that the industry remains commercially viable. So put all that together, kerosene is wonderful, right? It's connected our world like nothing else in the history of mankind, right? I mean, it's caused so much problem, but again, like you've already said, it's only 3%. So which is why I think sustainable aviation fuels are considered a great solution. But again, there's different ways of thinking about that, because that could also just be a bridge while we figure hydrogen out, for example, or while we maybe figure out some kind of electric or hybrid solution. It could be a mixture of these. One thing I'll just add, though, as part of your context setting at the start, I just want to make a note about kerosene. Because while I agree it's only 2 to 3%, and the rest of the world has recovered, and aviation is still struggling a bit after COVID, so it's actually probably even a bit less now as a percentage. The reality is other industries have solutions. Aviation, not really. We have to build those solutions. So by 2050, our estimates say that we could be looking at anywhere to 12 to 18% of CO2 emissions being just from aviation, if other industries do decarbonize and we're not really able to. It's still possible, given the certification issues and whatever. And to make matters worse, we're the only industry that likes burning things like kerosene at altitude, right? So you have CO2, that's a well-mixed gas that it doesn't really matter if you burn it on the ground or in the air. It's still the same impact. But nitrous oxides, contrails, you don't see agricultural equipment causing contrails, right? Even if agriculture is worse theoretically than aviation. So taking all of that into account, the total impact could be a lot worse, 2 to 3 times as bad as CO2 alone. So we need to work on it now. We need to get on with it, because come 2040, come 2050, it'll get too late. Just wanted to add that.
Okay, nice positive note to end on. Thank you. But it's a good point to bring in Susanne there. You mentioned about sustainable aviation fuel. So, Susanne, is this the best option for making aviation better for the environment in the short term, or like a bridge, like Nikhil said?
Yes, I believe so. However, maybe we should backtrack a little bit. Of course, one of the avenues that we need to explore is flying less, which I think everyone is already firmly believing in. That should be one of the avenues. And then the rest is, what can we do realistically now and today? And maybe first, what is SAF actually? So the wonderful concept around kerosene, obviously, is that can we create it from a different feedstock rather than pumping new fossil fuels out of the ground, which introduce new CO2 into the air. So at Neste, we've been producing sustainable aviation fuel since 2011. We're the largest producer, and very proud to say that SAF has been flown on over 400,000 flights today. And obviously that shows that there are solutions today, but also noting that the overall SAF use represents only less than 1% of overall aviation fuel, and we know that flying is here to stay and is growing into maybe double of the aviation fuel that's being used today. So yes, it is a solution today. Doesn't mean to say that there are other pathways that we shouldn't continue to explore. Very important. It won't be the silver bullet, but it will be for the short to medium term the solution that can help us on our way right now.
So what's the barrier to airlines actually using this fuel then? If, say, it only accounts for around 1%, why aren't they using more of it?
Well, first of all, we need to produce more of it. So we're very proud that we're scaling to about 15 times our current production capacity through to next year. But I think cost is obviously one element that's factored in. Currently, SAF is about 3 to 7 times more expensive. However, I think the good news is that fossil fuel is also super expensive at the moment, so the gap is closing. So if there is a good time for this, it will be now. But yes, cost is one of the main barriers, and the capacity overall.
If I may as well, just add to the point for those who aren't aware, when IATA signed up to net zero in 2021, they made it very, very clear that sustainable aviation fuel is going to do the bulk of achieving that target, i.e. 65% of the emission reduction by 2050 is coming from sustainable aviation fuel. That's from IATA. IATA, put simply, represent all the global major airlines in the world. So I think we need to be very careful and cognizant that SAF is absolutely essential. And I don't think when we talk about short-term, medium-term, long-term, 2050 is near-term. 2050 is going to come around very, very quickly. And it's the technologies that are being produced primarily by Neste, to be fair, that sustainable aviation fuel product, which is the pragmatic solution beyond flying less, that's going to get us to net zero by 2050.
Okay. Right, Rachael, you mentioned earlier that the aviation industry is very complex, or incestuous, I think is a word that you used.
Sorry.
You're going to regret that, I can tell. Should competitors, though, become more transparent with one another and work more, collaboratively in order to, work on these innovations in sustainable aviation?
Yeah, I think they have to, and I did use the word incestuous, so I'll roll with it. But if I look at Rolls-Royce's perspective, so we make the engine that goes on to someone else's manufactured the airframe, the plane. Then someone else chooses where they're going to fly it, what they're going to put on, how they're going to fly it. And this whole system has to work together. We have to remove some of the barriers to competition, and we have done some of that. So one of the things we have is a forum of chief technology officers for the aviation industry, and that set out some common goals around sustainability, working together in a pre-competitive environment. It's very corporate, but the idea is that we do have to look at these cross-cutting solutions, and that will be sustainable aviation fuels. And as we've just talked about, the problem there is not a technology problem, it's a problem of the market. So if we can work together as the system, as the sector, as the market to say, come on, we need more of this, then I've been turned off, but then that's a strong signal that we can send collaboratively and together. So yeah, we absolutely need to work.
I think we've just lost your mic. It's just dropped down slightly. There you go.
It's feeling very Brittany this morning.
You got it. I'll tell you what. I'll move on to another speaker. Maybe if we could just have somebody help Rachael out of her mic. Nikhil, I'm going to build a bridge between Rachael and yourself.
Wonderful.
How can airlines help customers make better decisions then when it comes to who they fly with and voting with their pound or with their dollar? So how can the airlines help customers make those choices?
Yes, it's an extremely important but broad question, and I think there's a lot of things that can be done. So I'll try to summarize rather than kind of going into everything. But part of it is flying less, right? So there are some airlines that are starting to do this, but the technical term would be intermodality. But basically allowing passengers to say, actually, you just want to get from London to Paris? Well, there is a Eurostar, and you can buy the Eurostar through our platform. So the airline doesn't lose out on that passenger. They don't lose out on their data, on their custom. They still have their custom, but there's actually alternative ways of getting there. Now that, unfortunately, isn't possible everywhere, right? So it's not just only about flying less, even though those options should be available. Then there's also offering them options on how to make their flight a bit more sustainable. And actually making that clear. Some airlines are starting to do it, but I'm afraid it's a shadow of what it could potentially be. I think a lot of airlines, no names here, but a lot of airlines do offer you the ability to buy SAF or the ability to offset or whatever it is. But it comes very late in the booking kind of process. I'd love to see it at the start, right? Now, interestingly enough, Skyscanner, Google Flights, they're doing a lot here. So I think they actually have probably a bigger role that they could play, because ultimately an individual airline only has so many options available. But as a network, and the extremely competitive environment in which airlines live, this is potentially another just lever for competitiveness. Lest I kind of suggest that kind of there isn't enough competition. I think there's a lot of competition already.
I agree with all of that. I think maybe just, again, a bit higher level to your question earlier about why is so little SAF being used. I think it's a bit of a chicken and an egg classic situation, but the reality is the political action, the government incentives are insufficient. They have been, they continue to be, and they're unlikely to get better. And therefore, major airlines, I think, are waiting for incentives, grants, to really ramp up and invest in SAF, and that's fair enough. These are huge organizations, far bigger than we are. But I don't think it's an excuse for airlines or booking platforms to make it far easier for consumers, of which we know there's a cohort, probably a lot of people in this room, who would definitely like to fly with a smaller carbon impact and make better decisions. The reality is, though, if we're going to shift behaviors, we need to make it far easier, just like with electric cars, although let's not talk about electric cars, or vegetarianism. All of these things are far easier today than they were 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago, right? The same thing needs to happen with the airlines and the booking platforms. And absolutely, to my point about it makes business sense, there's an enormous opportunity here for some big brands to come out and be known for making a difference, because we know there's appetite. We know there are people out there who will pay more to have a clear conscience when they're flying, whether that's private, first class, business class, Ryanair, EasyJet. Just to build on that again, so completely concur. I think there's a paradigm shift here as well from a cultural perspective, right? I think there's a lot of sustainability departments in a lot of airlines that exist that are having these conversations. I can say that is a fact, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is that the cultures of those airlines and in the actual boardroom or in the C-suites, they're not used to this. They're not used to making these kinds of decisions, right? They're used to dollars and cents because it's a highly competitive market. So to kind of get over that, it is the collective action thing that you alluded to earlier in your question to Rachael. And actually, this is a classic case in which if everyone can move together, I think they'll all do it. But if individuals have to kind of take that first toe in the water, I think it's going to take a lot longer if that happens.
That's true, but I suppose, and this again goes back to the session yesterday that QTS Data Center said, by offering those sustainability credentials as a differentiator, he claimed that it gave them actually a business advantage.
Yeah.
And that's what we need, right? We need some airlines, operators, whatever, to be a little bit braver maybe and put it front and center, like you were saying as well, Toby, and say, well, this is what we're going to do, and set out their stall and make it a point of difference, and presumably the paying customers will gravitate towards them.
It's true in the B2B space already today. Individual companies like Roland Berger, right? We have our own SBTI net zero target of 2028, right? We need to do this rapidly. In the B2C space, cost is still king. And unfortunately, these things are more expensive. don't know if anyone else would add to
Yeah,
that.
maybe just building on credibility and reporting is obviously one aspect to this. What is it that you then can say once you've spent and invested money into doing this? And I mean, just recognizing that this is still all voluntary and a really fast-moving environment in terms of standards and what's right, what's not right. I mean, science-based targets plays a huge role in obviously setting this course. And there is aviation guidance that they've issued. Our solution to help organizations actually act on their commitments is in line with science-based targets, and I think this is hugely important to show that, I mean, this is just not one of the other solutions. It's the credible way now, today, that you can take action.
So I was just going to add, I think we're talking about the change of incentivization for airlines, but we can't ignore the fact that the increased traffic in aviation is not in Europe and the UK and America. It's in Africa, it's in Asia Pacific region, and that's where the kind of cost argument for sustainability really comes to fruition, because we need to make the way that the economics balance out so the sustainable choice is the more economically stable and resilient choice as well. And that's how I think we're going to really tackle this, because we can talk about European airlines prioritizing sustainability, and they absolutely should, and I'm not underestimating that. But the aviation does have to work collectively, because we have to level out across that global playing field, because we can't ignore the socio-economic benefits that come from aviation, and we can't deny people in Africa and Asia Pacific those opportunities.
Toby?
Yeah, and just following up on that point, on a personal level, I don't think young people flying short flights in Europe with some of the well-known less expensive airlines should be the ones necessarily who are suddenly having to pay loads more to fly sustainably. I think that, again, it has to start with the people who can afford to make those decisions, the people today who aren't currently in an energy crisis and do have a greater disposable income. And again, there are people who have that, who also do care deeply about the environment. I don't think there's a correlation, just because you're an Extinction Rebellion activist or a high net worth individual flying private doesn't have anything to do with how much you care about the planet. You probably still have grandchildren, nephews or nieces. And so we need to be, I think there's misinformation which also doesn't help in terms of us all working together and doing things correctly.
Okay, let's put this into context then. We talked about maybe paying a higher fee. So let's say there was an airfare, let's say it's $100. Now, if that flight was to be 100% on sustainable fuel, what difference in price would that make to that flight? I've got no idea.
It would be about 20% more expensive to fly with 100% sustainable aviation fuel instead of fossil fuel.
Okay, all right, that's good. That's a good yardstick to use. So quick poll of the audience then. If you just have a show of hands, if you had the option of paying 20% more for your flight and it being 100% sustainable aviation fuel, would you rather have the choice of paying that extra 20%, and would you?
Yeah. So
Today, yes.
current certification is 50-50.
Yep.
Okay, can I just have the hands up again for everyone who was saying that?
It's brilliant.
Okay, yeah, it's a vast majority, if not all there. Who wouldn't pay it, just out of interest? Okay, good. It's good to have honesty.
Some confident hands.
Yeah.
I would just say that I'm different, and it's terrible. The aviation industry, I can't pay for some of the costs. What am I paying? And people like me are already very eco-conscious and hardly ever travel. Where's my incentive? I get one flight a year. Why should I be sort of penalised? Yeah. And instead I should be rewarded. Hey, you've only flown once.
If I may, I'd look.
Actually, just 1 second. Just to repeat the question, because our viewers at home watching online will not have heard that. The question was, why don't the airlines or the operators absorb that cost rather than passing it on to the consumer? Toby?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. It's a really, really good question. So I think they should, but we need both. So that question is actually, as consumers, what can we all do voluntarily to help us get to net zero? If you purchase SAF on your flight, you're benefiting from the Scope 3 emission reduction. Or forget scopes. The emission reduction is yours. You own it. Whatever you paid for with that SAF, that's for you to claim as an individual, or if you're flying for a business, you can use that emission reduction for that business's Scope 3 emission reductions. For the airlines, they have their own targets. When we talk about reaching 2050, 65% being SAF, that's currently not including any voluntary contributions. That is solely airlines taking SAF at the airport, scope 1, for their planes in order to fly. So to put things, I think there's kind of two parts, right? There's the voluntary part, which is the consumers, which we control, we can take ownership, our customers, our business, and then you have the airlines who equally have their own agendas, they have to have their own targets, and that's they're also working towards those. So hopefully that just provides clarity. It's not either or, we need both, but I'm a massive advocate of us all doing our thing, just like cycling to work or whatever you do. You mentioned that you do your own things, fantastic, but also let the airlines. My fear is that the airlines don't go quick enough, the booking platforms don't go quick enough, because potentially not their fault, right? Because the governments aren't putting enough incentive in there, and then we fail. We're all in this together, so we need to do both.
Okay, right. I think it's time where we actually throw questions out to the floor. We do have a microphone here. Tom, if you can just go to the lady closest to you to begin with. If you can just begin, please, by stating your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Rebecca, and I'm from a design company. And I think my main question is regarding the science of the sustainable aviation fuel. My experience at the producing company is that we are being told to use HVO a lot, but when you actually speak to scientists, HVO emits as much carbon as diesel, but it has a lower carbon footprint because it's made from biomass products. And I personally think, as a 27 years old, that's not a very acceptable way to do science. So what is sustainable aviation fuel, and does it reduce carbon because there's planes in it?
Okay, thank you. Really good question. Susanne?
Yeah, super good question. I think I alluded to it before, and I mean, I can't debate the overall science here, and I mean, if you want to get into the details, my colleagues are also here to chat with you later, but I think what we're saying is that we're not extracting new carbon out of the soil, we're using the existing carbon resources of waste and residue materials that are already here, that are renewable resources, such as waste cooking oil, to put that into the process again. So, yeah, happy to debate the science behind it, but that's what's available today in terms of explaining how this works in simple terms.
I think just to add to it as well, there's different types of SAFs, right? So there are bio-based SAF, right? And you're right that, you know, in a world in which there's a food crisis, there's also a water crisis. We can't indefinitely just say, okay, it's all going to be bio-based forevermore. And no one's actually saying that, which is wonderful, because there's another type of SAF called PTL, or synthetic SAF, or sometimes called e-fuel, right, which is literally made from water and air, right? So you electrolyze water and you get hydrogen out of that, and you take air, and through carbon capture you extract carbon out of that, merge them together in a very complex process, and you actually get a fuel, which is just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And we are transitioning to that, but it's extremely slow and extremely expensive.
And that transition point, I think, is absolutely key. So the sustainable aviation fuel product that Neste generate, it reduces emissions by up to 80% of the greenhouse gases. Today, right now, that's a brilliant product. It might not be absolutely perfect, but right now, it is the best solution. Of course, there are some amazing scientists out there working on power to liquid, for example. The reality is, though, that power to liquid, for example, at the moment would consume so much power. There just isn't enough renewable energy on the grid to actually use that tech at scale. So we need to focus on the solutions here and now today that work, and accept that in 3-4 years they might not be the best solutions. It's exactly the same with offsetting, right? 3 or 4 years ago, offsetting was the pragmatic solution for reducing your emissions on your flights. Today, is it still? Well, that's questionable. I think it depends on the quality of the offsetting program, the offsettings themselves, how much you're paying for your offsets. So I think we need to keep being present, use solutions available for the people who can afford those solutions. And then I really believe passionately that the scientists, people will work it out, and it will scale, and we'll come to good solutions by 2050, hopefully sooner.
Okay, thank you for your question. If you can put your hands up again, Tom, if you can work your way around. I'm just going to take a question that's come in from our online audience first, though. And it might be one for you, Toby, I'm not sure here. It says, how scalable is SAF? because we talked about the 20% price increase. Does that include the cost of the infrastructure to deliver that? 20% appears to be an astoundingly low premium.
So the premium question, it's currently 20% more expensive. And that's to do 100%. I appreciate, to the lady's point at the moment, to blend.
Yeah.
The difference is likely to reduce because obviously the cost of fossil fuel on current trends is increasing. So actually the gap is coming down. In terms of how scalable it is, of course, I mean, aerospace, but mankind in general has always taken on challenges as well. Yes, SAF is quite literally, SAF is the Everest for aviation, right? But it can scale, of course it can. I mean, just take Neste again as an example. They're putting huge investment into a new Rotterdam refinery that's coming open next year. Likewise, in Singapore, an enormous new refinery. And there's plans for many other great businesses have plans to open their own refineries. I mean, in the UK, I think there's 5 pending being open. So it is a bit of, again, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. But if everyone who consumes aviation, whatever class, was like, hang on a minute, I've heard about this great product which reduces my CO2 emissions by 80%, right? And everyone goes for it. Actually, there's not enough of that product today, to the question, which will then ramp massive investment. The money will then be there because people will know there will be certainty that there is actually demand for this product. And then everything will snowball very, very quickly.
Okay, yeah, that does make sense. Okay, if we take the question, if you can just state your name, where you're from, please.
Hello, good morning. Mark Cusack, I'm from Further. I feel like there's almost an elephant in the room or a word that hasn't been said, and that's tax. And I'd be really interested in the panel's view on central government, maybe United Nations role and taxation in driving sustainable behaviour, so we don't act in our own self-interest, whether that be as a company or whether that be as an individual. Thank you.
I think let's make a start. I think there is a clear role for a global carbon tax in this environment, but the challenge is it has to be global. When we're looking at aviation, we talked about the kind of London to Paris and things. If you look at kind of national-based taxation in isolation, perhaps, if the UK or even Europe introduced carbon taxes and it wasn't universal, you're just going to move the problem. You're just going to shift. People will fly into, say, Schiphol and then get the train rather than into London, for example. So if we want to actually mitigate the carbon emissions, we need to look at it universally, and I think that's going to be the real barrier. But yeah, I do think carbon taxes, particularly around SAFs and particularly around levelling out that playing field, could play a really important role. But it's just going to be almost impossible, I think, to introduce.
Yeah, and flip it on its head, actually. We've talked about airlines and the opportunity there, but actually for governments, right? Obviously, if you invest in opening new sustainable aviation fuel refineries in your country, you're going to have enormous economic benefits from that, all the jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that you can grow into this sustainable world without necessarily having to tax people. In the meantime, I think that consumers can play a big voluntary role, which is actually probably enough in the very short term to get the ball moving faster.
I think I'll add one more thing. We already pay a lot of tax in aviation, so there's taxation that airlines obviously have to pay, normal corporation tax, but every single time someone takes off, included in the ticket is an air passenger duty that is paid ultimately to the government. In Europe, we already pay the ETS, which is a function of how much carbon an airline is producing, and ultimately that airline needs to build those costs into their ticket price. So as consumers, we're already paying a lot of tax to fly, a heck of a lot actually. And if you ever cancelled a flight ticket, that's definitely the part that you typically get back, right? The airline might have to keep the rest, but the tax you usually get back. So it's a fair chunk. The interesting thing, though, is what I'd love to see more, in addition to a global carbon tax, which would be the gold standard solution, right? Maybe the silver standard or the bronze standard solution would be taking the existing taxation that we're already putting out into the industry, but changing it, right? Saying, okay, we're going to collect the same amount of money, right? But we're going to tax those who pollute more, right? So it becomes a bit like a carbon tax. And the airlines that have younger aircraft with better engines, right, they pay less tax because they have less CO2 per passenger or something along those lines. And that's not enough in the discourse, I think. without taxing more, we can still have an impact.
Agreed. This will take time. I mean, yeah.
Okay, let's take one more final question from the audience, please. Tom, I'll let you decide who gets that. If you can just state your name and try and keep it brief, please, because we are running out of time.
Thank you. I actually had two, but I understand that I'm limited to one. So I believe there is... Sorry?
Just the one, please, yeah.
So I believe there is also an elephant in the hallway at the moment, which is Google obviously airbrushed off quite a bit of CO2 on Google flights, and at the moment we have Google speaking about fighting climate change on stage 2. So what is your opinion on that?
Toby, we were talking about this backstage earlier, weren't we?
Yeah, I think clearly when you fly, right, my understanding from the brief reading I've done with Google is that they're now only covering the actual flight, but there's a lot of other emissions around. Sorry, only the CO2 on the flight, and then you've got the contrails, you've obviously got everything involved with that flight as well. So actually the footprint of the flight is far greater than what's being illustrated online. I think, look, clarity, transparency, clear chain of custody, these all help credibility. And so the media need to help organizations that are doing things the right way to show that it can be done and what is correct. I don't necessarily blame, it's difficult, right? We talked about how things are imperfect at the moment. They're not going to be. We have to jump in the deep end and work on things, and some things won't necessarily be right. I think credit to Google for putting it there in the first place. The fact that it's not quite right, well, I think they're going to come under a lot of pressure probably from experts to make it better. That's how I'd answer that.
I was just going to say there's movement, particularly in Europe at the moment, to introduce what we call eco-labels. So like when you go and buy, I don't know, a washing machine or even a house, you can get your kind of energy rating. They're looking to do that at an airplane level to help with consumer transparency. It's also really, really difficult because it depends on what type of fuel you've used, where you fly. Contrails is so difficult to predict where and when and for how long and for how persistent they're going to be. Also remember, contrails can have a cooling and a warming effect. The science shows us it's overwhelmingly warming, but there is some complexities there that makes it really difficult to get this data right. I think we are on a journey as an industry, and we know that transparency, shared information and shared kind of cloud-based data is going to become really important to help with all the themes we've been talking around consumer choices. But I think we can't, as you say, criticise the kind of early movers here because it is a complicated space and it's only going to get better.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you for your question. Very briefly, panel, I just want to go around all of you. If you can try and answer in like one sentence, please. Really difficult one for this one, though, for a short answer. So what do you see as the future of aviation, and what do we need to do to make the sector more sustainable and to meet these targets? Susanne?
I would say behavior change being one. Just let's make the sustainable choices, and let's also make those available to everyone that's dependent on aviation in one way or another.
I would say diverse. You're going to have, we haven't talked about electric flight, you will see that at the small scale of the market. You'll see hydrogen powered. You'll still see your big conventional wide body aircraft for your transatlantics, but you're going to see so much more diversity over the choices that are available and the technologies that you see.
I mean, obviously the future of flight has to be sustainable, but I think the biggest issue is coordination, and we've talked about it a fair bit actually in this panel. The worst thing would be if Europe says we're going to tackle this, then no one else does. You know, we're only going to be 15 to 20% of aviation by 2050. It's not very effective if only we do it. So everyone needs to coordinate.
And I would say, kind of Susanne's point about behaviours, actually, if you're in a privileged position to be able to influence the behaviours and make it far easier for people to make better decisions, then please start doing that as soon as possible.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. I mean, we could talk about this so much more. It makes me feel that we should be doing a feature on this in a future issue of Sustainability magazine, so I will reach out to you and see if we can arrange that as well. But please join me in thanking Toby, Nikhil, Rachael and Susanne. Thank you.